Today I'm joined by Jessica Impson. Jessica is the owner and one of two founders of a traditional women's group on Facebook. She is a wife and mother of two boys. Jess is an adult convert to Catholicism along with her husband. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology with a minor in History and is currently finishing her graduate studies at Divine Mercy University. Jessica spent her entire adult life serving as a sworn law enforcement officer before becoming a stay-at-home mother and wife. She enjoys homeschooling her children in a traditional Catholic curriculum, cooking, baking, crafts, and gardening. Jess, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, let's get to it. Can you tell us a bit about your catechesis and whether you come from a traditional Catholic background?
So interestingly enough, I do come from a Catholic background, although I was an adult convert. So essentially, my biological father, my dad, we're very close today. He was a cradle Catholic and had gone to Catholic school his entire life. Ironically, his mother, my grandmother, was very traditional Catholic. So they were immigrants from Cuba, and her parents had come from Spain. And, you know, she had spent her entire adult life discerning whether or not to be a consecrated person before she discerned the vocation of marriage to what became my grandfather, essentially. And so my father himself had a lot of tradition in his upbringing, but when he became an adult, he sort of fell away from his faith. He married my mom, who was not Catholic. She was a watered down Protestant who essentially didn't attend church. And, you know, subsequently, you know, he kind of just didn't take his faith seriously. He left the church, was married outside of the church, all these things like that. Fast forward, you know, all of my siblings that were born before me were indeed baptized in the Catholic Church, but I wasn't. By the time I was born, my parents were already looking at potentially getting a divorce or so-called secular divorce, you know. And so I essentially was growing up, like I had attended Mass quite infrequently, but regularly, if that makes sense. So, you know, I would say in a month's given time, at least twice. My grandparents would often take me. And so I saw that. I obviously wasn't at any point in time able to partake in communion. I had gone to some of the child-related camps at the Catholic Church growing up and things, but I was just never baptized. You know, several times in my older years when I went into college, I attempted to go into RCIA and go through the catechesis process to become Catholic. And, you know, in those particular periods of time, there were issues that I observed in some of the more modern parishes at that time, and I made a decision not to go. Fast forward, I ended up doing a lot of studying, a lot of research, and I made a decision to become baptized and confirmed in the Orthodox Church. So the Russian Orthodox Church was my original quote unquote home. And then upon further studying and sort of discernment, prayer especially, I made a decision to finally be received into the Catholic faith. Catechesis in a formal sense, I didn't really receive that, right? So the only catechesis that was available around me was really at these, you know, parishes locally. And I had some issues with some of the things that the lay persons that were teaching the courses were saying to prospective Catholics. And so a lot of my catechesis actually came from my own independent studying. You know, St. Joseph, there's several books I have from that series, the Baltimore Catechism, the Council of Trent, reading the Church Fathers, the Church Doctors, some of the encyclical documents, and really just doing my own sort of studying. And then almost immediately from, you know, my conversion from Orthodoxy into Catholicism, I met a very traditional priest and was able to, you know, form a pretty close relationship with him and several others who had been Catholic much longer and were able to sort of help me navigate my faith.
And what made you decide to take that route?
I think, well, you know, from meaning like the leap from Orthodoxy into Catholicism, or?
No, what made you decide to get baptized and to embrace, you know, the full faith? So as a child, obviously you weren't, you know, fully into it. So what made you decide I need to embrace this?
I remember, and it's funny, it's the shortest possible answer, but I would be negligent not to mention it. My grandmother. So my father's mother helped raise me. She was a big part of my life. It was a very small town growing up, and I was with her almost every day. And at one point in time, I actually lived with her for quite some years. She would constantly try to talk to me about the Catholic faith and pray. It was always very heartbreaking and devastating to her that I had not been baptized. She had told that story repeatedly about, how heartbreaking that was really for her and how it was her dream to see me become baptized truthfully. And at that point, I was a teenager getting ready to go to, college. So I think she was kind of the opinion that she didn't want to force it on me. She wanted me to make an independent decision to actually become Catholic. She had gone out and purchased me a Catholic Bible. And it was leather bound. She had my name inscribed onto the book, and she gave it to me as a gift. And, I didn't really know what to do with it because I really wasn't going to any church, so-called church at the time, much less a Catholic church. And I kind of looked at her oddly, and I said, Grandma, what is this? And she said, that's the Bible. And I didn't say anything in response. I think she was reading my body language. And she said, you may not think you need it now, but one day you will. And you can, even if you don't look at it now, just put it away, tuck it away, and hold on to it, because I pray that you'll use it one day. And I still have that Bible today. It's on my nightstand. And ironically, later on, when I became an adult and into college, I joined the Army National Guard. I was actually in training. Some of the reading materials, the very few reading materials that you are permitted to have, one of which is the Bible. I brought that with me. And I started reading through it. And it started inspiring me. I was 17 years old, getting ready to be 18. It started inspiring me to really ponder who is God, right? I never explicitly denied the existence of God, but I didn't really know who he was. And so I really started on this journey of investigation. Long story short, in about 10 years, from 17 to 27, I had gone to almost every single so-called church there was. I had been to Jewish temples, Baptist churches, Protestant, all kind of Protestant churches. I think the only type of so-called church structure I have not been to on the Protestant side is the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's the only one I haven't investigated. I'm serious. I even investigated the Mormons. I've read through, I read the Bible front to back multiple times, and I started, taking theology courses and really studying the faith and trying to understand, who is Christ? How do we know he's real? What is the evidence of his existence? And what does the church say? And all roads led back to Catholicism, every single one of them. And it was so funny because in short spurts of attending these Protestant churches, I might go to this Baptist church for a couple months to see what it was about, or go over here to this Methodist one to see what it was about. Each and every single time, even at those young ages, I had enough discernment and enough education formally from the university and in theology to pick up on things that these so-called pastors were saying that were not correct. And I would strike me and I'd be like, that's not correct. And then it would just kind of go downhill from there, and I would move on to the next. And all the roads led back to Catholicism. And ironically, at about 22, it occurred to me that I wanted to be a Catholic, that was the right church to be in. That was the only true church, dogmatically sound and correct and everything. I believed all the dogmas of the faith and everything the church had to say. I allowed an error in my youth at 22 years old, my really poor experience with a layman that was teaching the catechesis to adults, RCIA at the church at that time, to sway me and to discourage me. I remember it was the topic that came up precisely was on homosexual relationships and same-sex unions. He was trying to create a sense of doubt in the catechumes, and he was saying, how do we know that that's not acceptable in the eyes of God? And I said, that's contrary to what the church teaches. And we kind of got into a bit of a discussion, and I left and I didn't come back. And so what I was looking for was, where is the church? In my youth, my question to me when I set out on that journey, apart from who is God, was, what church possesses the truth, right? What church is most biblically sound, most accurate, and where is that going to be? And, in my journey, the safest place I had found, in my opinion, at that time was the Orthodox Church, only because of that one experience with that guy in the Catholic Church. And so once I started doing more investigation, I learned about the traditional Latin Mass. I learned about, obviously the different issues in the post-conciliar church. I realized that I allowed that experience to delay me from really coming home. And I made the decision to become Catholic.
That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Was your grandmother around to see you baptized?
Unfortunately, no. So she died, she died 3 years before I became Catholic. So she didn't live to see me become a Catholic, unfortunately. So that was one of the things I kind of, one of my current regrets in life.
Bless her.
Yeah.
Okay. So my next question is, in the traditional Latin Mass, a lot of people feel that women are oppressed, or they get this feeling that the men, traditional men, oppress their women. What are your thoughts on that? Especially in traditional marriage, let's say. There's this notion that couples who are more traditional, the women are subservient to their husbands. What are your thoughts on that?
So I would first, if this was an individual who perhaps was making that accusation, my first response then would be to define the concept of oppression to me. What is oppression? You know, we have this, we have this relativistic, sort of subjective notion about a lot of things in the world today, and that goes along with that modernistic, ideologue that's permeating in the world, and it's disordered. So I would ask them, what does oppression look like exactly? Because to me, in my experience, I mean, I have been, because of being an adult convert, I had been working full time. And unfortunately, I had entered into a relationship prior to my now Catholic marriage where I did have children, and did set up a secular institution that was made to look like a marriage, although it was not. And the church declared it not to be so. And I remember that time frame of my life, that in itself was oppression. Slaving around, working full time in a job that was meant to be held by a man, and I was missing out on key fundamental moments in my children's lives that I can never get back. I can't bring back their first steps that I missed when they were in daycare. I can't bring back the field trips that I couldn't be a part of, or the school activities, or doing their homework with them, or teaching them these critical things in the early formative years. And so to me, having to work and having to, it's, feminism is this weird, ideology, right? So it's kind of like, we're women, hear us roar, we want to be equal to man, but we're still expected societally to do all the things that a traditional woman would do, right? We still have to raise our kids, we still have to cook, do all these things, but we're still going out and doing all these other things. So we're really sort of absorbing a double burden, in that way. Not that raising children is a burden. I'm saying we're assuming twice the work when it's unnecessary. So what I would say in regards, when a traditional marriage is established, and a woman and a wife and her husband are actually genuinely living out their vocation in the way that God has intended to them, it is so beautiful. It is so beautiful, and it's so peaceful, and it's so wonderful. God calls the husband to love his wife like Christ loved the church. And so what does that look like? That's a magnificent love, right? And so that love is not abusive. It's not oppressive. It's not degrading. It's not derogatory. It's not demeaning. It's the sort of love that's not only merciful, but boasts up and supports the woman, protects and loves and encourages. And similarly, the role of the wife is to support and to encourage the husband in his spiritual journey towards heaven, and her spiritual journey towards heaven. So it's the exact opposite of oppression. It's liberating. It's, I'm finally in my life as a traditional Catholic woman and wife able to do all of the things that I have not been able to do my entire adult life. And it's been such a wonderful journey, really. And it's almost like, you get to this point halfway through, kind of sarcastically, where you're like, what crazy woman ever said that we were supposed to go out there and work and do all these things? I'm like, I would have had this conversation with her, and I'm kind of mad about this because, the society, if we really look as women, particularly, I don't know how old you are or some of the viewers that will watch this, but, a lot of women, particularly if they were born in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s, there's a cultural sort of indoctrination, even sort of passively, where we've all been sort of encouraged to go out and get these jobs, to work, to get these education, to do all these things outside of the home. And you look back on that, and you start to wonder, you're like, why didn't anybody ever tell me that I could stay at home and educate my son and clean and cook and do these wonderful things that God really wanted me to do, right? So the most important role and responsibility of any single mother, and if she's not a mother yet, a Catholic wife, is the role of a wife, right? And it is the role of educating and bringing up children in the home. And hypothetically, if the couple couldn't have children, perhaps adopting children or fostering children, or even not that, even going and doing charity work and doing other things that she can be equally rewarding and fulfilling, that don't require her to engage in that sort of dynamic that is oppressive, really.
Yes. So you've experienced both with your first marriage and now with your current marriage.
Yeah.
Do you feel a difference in yourself?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, your faith has to be, God is center, right? He is number one. And your faith has to be in every aspect of your life in order for the vocation really to work and flourish, right? And, you know, I listen to Father Ripperger a lot. I listen to a lot of other priests pretty regularly throughout the week. And, you know, one of the things that we start to do when we start taking our faith seriously and we're trying to grow spiritually, and we're really trying to sift through these spiritual impediments to holiness, is we start to look interiorly and on how all these things sort of have been perverted and distorted throughout our lives, even in childhood. You know, the self-love, the self-gratification on worldly things, the desire to possess those things. And we start sifting through those and purging them. It is a bit of a process depending on what a person's particular inclinations towards certain vices may be, but it's an entirely rewarding process. And, you know, I can look back in my life and see how before I was Catholic and had these recognitions and these understandings, how I valued those worldly things. I really thought that my self-worth was driven by how many degrees I had,
Wow.
how many promotions at work and law enforcement I could obtain, how pretty my house was, and making it look like a Pottery Barn catalog and perfected, and all these superficial things that have absolutely nothing to do with heaven and have absolutely nothing to do with the vocation, and really just drag the soul down, right? They're all distractions that are meant to purposefully and intentionally distract us from those heavenly things so that your soul will be damned, essentially, and you'll drag yourself into hell, you know?
Right. And it must make a strain as well on the actual marriage.
Absolutely.
Focusing on those things.
Absolutely. Because when you see, here's the thing is when you belief, when you possess the fundamental belief and you follow the particular ideology that you are indeed equal to your husband and you can do all the things that he does, and what you end up seeing, and you can see this in a lot of couples today, married couples, and they typically don't last very long, is that there's like this overt desire of the wife to control the husband, to have him submit to her, for her to be in charge. And those dynamics never last long. They are precisely, just like Father Ripperger has said, it is the demons infiltrating, and they attack the wife and they attack the woman to sort of create that divisiveness in the home and create that sort of disorderedness. And it's really an inversion of what God intended for a husband and wife to be like. And what ends up happening is this situation just erupts and escalates, and either the couple is in a perpetual cycle of misery and power struggle and control, but what also ends up happening is they almost always fail. They end up in a secular divorce, and, you know, then you have a broken home and the demons have won again. You know, you have children that are growing up in a disordered situation, fractured homes, and it's really a terrible cycle. And unfortunately, America in particular has fallen into that, and that's evidenced by the divorce rates. It's evidenced by the single mother homes. So clearly this pursuit since the 1960s, when we look statistically at the number of Catholic marriages before Vatican II and in the 60s, this civil rights movement, this revolutionary ideas, feminism in particular, we look at the number of Catholic marriages and they were astronomical. And we look at the number of Catholic marriages today and they're less than 10%. And we look at what that's produced. We have a shortage in the priesthood. We have a shortage in vocations within the church, consecrated life. We have all of these things that come back to feminism, and they've really destroyed not only the family dynamic, but they've destroyed the mind of the woman and corrupted it so badly that it has infected almost every other aspect of our culture. And it's really unfortunate.
That's very true. Also, the number of children that Catholic couples are having now has decreased.
Absolutely.
Substantially.
The NFP thing, as well as, you know, I think what they said back before Vatican II in the 1960s, I think the average number of children. If you move back even further in history, it was like 6 and 7 children at least. And now today, most Catholic couples have 2 children or less, depending on what country you're looking at. And so it's clearly not working. I mean, if feminism was this really great idea, right? If it was this, amazing revelation, we wouldn't have the number of divorces that we do today. We wouldn't have the number of abortions. We wouldn't have the number of contracepting couples and separated homes and children born in single mother homes and things of that nature. It's been a terrible thing. And it all goes back. I think that a lot of the viewers, if they were interested, could watch a lot of the Father Ripperger series. He hit it on the nail. This all goes back to communism. And it's really some of it's a Freemasonic deliberate attempt to really destroy Catholicism globally.
We'll link to those videos from Father Ripperger. Okay, so do you feel that it's more difficult to be a traditional Catholic wife now in 2021 than it was 10 or 20 years ago?
Absolutely, I do.
Okay.
And we see that in the church. So when I answer this question, I'm referring to Catholic women, Catholic wives in particularly. We are surrounded today by a culture of death, really, a culture that is telling us that, we should be in charge, that we shouldn't be told what to do. We shouldn't be submissive. We shouldn't, listen to our husbands. Why can't he listen to us? Why can't we work outside of the home? All these things. And we see that demonstrated in society as a whole, broadly. Right. And so there's a lot of temptation for women, and even some of the best traditional women, or women who identify on the traditional spectrum, so to speak, they will demonstrate this in their lives. I see it all the time. In fact, I just had a friend recently that I observed the same sort of pattern in. This was a traditional Catholic couple who I could see this sort of passively in the woman, controlling the husband, running the finances, bossing him around, and really sort of trying to dominate that situation. And there was a lot of disorder and a lot of issues in that home. And I see that. And so today we have all of these pressures around us, and we have a lot of priests who aren't teaching on it. We have a lot of people who are being quiet on it, and they're not really giving a lot of instruction. And so a lot of women, unfortunately, feel the sense of despair where they don't really know precisely, are they living out their vocation correctly? 1, and 2, are they doing what God intended for them in their marriage? And then 3, where do they go? If they are at a particular level in their marriage, in their vocation of marriage, they're like, where do I go next? And then they're simultaneously just surrounded by this culture of death that's telling them everything that they're doing is disordered and wrong, and they're oppressed and they're victims, and this is just so horrible. So there's all these temptations constantly around this woman.
Right. And on that note, biblically, the Lord tells us, woman, respect your husbands, and husbands, love your wives. And I found in my own marriage, and looking at the marriages of my friends who are not traditional, that works. And the minute that particular balance of respect and love is unbalanced, things start to fall apart.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I think that today, women are looking more for respect for some reason from their husbands. Like you say, they want to be respected. They want to be seen, have a career. And by doing that, they have turned their whole marriage on its head, which is one of the main reasons why marriages are collapsing today.
Absolutely.
So on advice for women, a lot of women in our group are attending the Novus Ordo Mass. And they feel intimidated. When they look at the Latin Mass, they see the woman veiling, and obviously it's not in the vernacular. What advice do you have for those women who are feeling like they want to start attending, or they're feeling called to the Latin Mass, but they're feeling nervous, or they're feeling that they won't quite know how to fit in? What advice do you have for those women?
I will say this, that I actually started when I first came from Orthodoxy into Catholicism. I was actually, because I was still working at the time, I wasn't yet married in the Catholic Church. So I was actually going to the one and only Catholic parish in the community that I was a full-time a detective. I was a law enforcement investigator officer there. And that was a Novus Ordo parish. Now, the priest was very traditional. In fact, I think almost all the masses he was ad orientem. He would do communion on the tongue, things of that nature. But there was still a lot of Novus Ordo sort of vibe there with the parishioners. What I can say is that just having been there myself and coming from there, I was a little bit opposite because I was coming from Orthodoxy, which I was already veiling. It was very modest. It was very conservative. So a lot of the things I was observing in the parish kind of overwhelmed me. I felt uncomfortable because I felt like the weirdo. I was like the only one wearing a long sleeve black maxi dress with my veil on, and these women would like kind of look at me and be like, and so my advice to them would be, number one, don't be afraid. It's not about what other people think. You're here to serve God. Everything that we do in our lives has to be for the glorification of God. The moment that we take that focus and the emphasis off of God and we place it on ourselves, how we feel, how we experience things, how we perceive situations, is the moment that we lose the true purpose and the true focus and the true emphasis of what we're there for, right? Which is to glorify, serve, and sacrifice for God. And so take your focus off of that and look onto the tabernacle of our blessed Lord and think only of Christ and think of our Blessed Virgin Mary and her beauty and her modesty and all of the traditions of the church for more than 2,000 years. And disregard the individuals around you who are not only trying to tempt you away from what is true and beautiful, but who are trying to sway you in the wrong direction. Because chances are those individuals at some point have either thought about the same thing or they're just projecting their own form of like self-hatred onto you. So you have to really just kind of disregard that and make that step. Come to the Latin Mass. I promise that all of the traditional women will be welcoming, hopefully. Maybe a few won't be, but offer that up and know that you're making the right decision as you make the transition into the beauty and the sacredness of tradition. I hear the complaint about the veil a lot, which is a lot of women who are new to tradition and they're coming to parishes that are at the Latin Mass. They feel really overwhelmed because they're like, I don't have this call yet to wear this veil, or, I just don't feel that way, right? So I just wrote a whole piece on the history of the mantilla and why one would wear one. And so I highly encourage people to actually give that a chance and to look at that. But even if they haven't arrived there yet, my best advice would be just to go, give it a try. Go, take that last step. It's kind of one of those things that if you never go and if you spend more time worrying about what people think and your fears and all these things, those are all temptations of Satan to draw you away from what is true and what is just and what is good for your soul, right? So that's my advice.
Thank you. Okay. These are marriage questions. What qualities do you think that young Catholic women should be looking for if they wish to have a successful marriage? Looking for in a man?
Virtue, 200%. And that'll go along the lines with the link I'll provide to you for sensustraditionis.org by Father Ripperger. I followed it. I've pretty much exhausted all of his conferences. But there's also a lot of homilies available through the society, through the fraternity, through ICK and a number of other parishes and good priests, even Novus Ordo priests who are talking about it. We have to, when we're dating a person, first of all, we should understand that dating in Catholicism is really for the purpose of discerning the vocation of marriage with that person, right? So the moment that you decide that this person is not somebody you're going to marry, then you shouldn't be dating them anymore. Right. There seems to be some confusion in the Catholic social media world about this, but I just wanted to make that very clear. So when you get past that first hump and you say, okay, I think this person might be somebody I would consider, then you need to start examining them in their level of virtues. Okay, and what we're talking about in particularly is temperance and prudence. You need to look at their level of prayer. You need to look at how serious they are about their faith, because you're examining this individual as a woman. You're looking at this man and you're asking, is this man going to be able to not only provide for me financially, maybe not a Lamborghini and a $10 million castle, but is he going to be able to provide that basic quality of life, a house and food in your belly, and be able to take care of you? Is he stable-minded? Does he have good self-constraint over his passions? If he's immodest, if he's very promiscuous, or in his speech or in his decorum, these are all things you need to examine and really pray about. My best advice to a woman who's thinking about potentially marrying a gentleman that she is dating is to, hopefully she's already going to mass frequently with this individual. They're praying together, they're dating in an appropriate manner in public, and they're being chaste, and they're not living together. They're living out the true teachings of the church, but they're going to mass and they're meeting with a priest regularly even, and asking those questions or concerns. They're having open exchange about, how do you as a man see the role and responsibility of the wife? What is your expectation according to the teachings of the church and what you know to be true of what you would see me doing as your wife? How do you envision that? Because he's going to tell you. If you ask him that question, if you're, say, hypothetically having coffee, and you say to your boyfriend, if that's the term we want to use, and you ask him, how do you envision, if I were your wife, what do you envision my responsibilities to look like, or what would I be doing? What would be my role? He's going to give you a response, and that response you can then take and weigh against the teachings of the church and what you know to be true. Is he telling you that you're going to have to work? Is he going to expect you to do things that aren't typically associated with your vocation and role as a wife and as a mother? Does he want your children or future potential children to go to school, not go to school? He's going to tell you all the things that you need to know, that you can take and pray and discern about. The key is having the conversation. A lot of young women and young men who will deliberately negotiate, particularly traditional Catholics. And I hate that term, by the way, traditional Catholics, because we're all just Catholic, right?
Right.
I keep saying traditional Catholic, but I really despise that term. So forgive me for using it, because it's really just Catholic. If an individual is truly authentically Catholic, right, they're going to, they're going to demonstrate this not only in their everyday life, but they're going to demonstrate this by what they say and their intentions. And I see, for example, I've personally known a handful of good Catholic men and women who were perhaps engaged in a romantic sort of courtship for the purposes of discerning marriage. And I could physically observe that they were deliberately dating somebody. Maybe they were really good looking, but they were not really good Catholics.
Right.
So they were not modest in their dress. They were not modest in speech. They were not responsible. They didn't have good self-constraint, good comportment about them. There was a lack of temperance and prudence that was exuded in many facets of the life. And so my question to them would be, are you compromising your faith and what you know to be righteous and what the actual sacrament of marriage looks like for the sake of having an attractive wife or husband? I see this all too often. So we have to first look at that. All I can tell women is, when I was dating my own husband, when we were courting, naturally my situation was a little bit more difficult than, say, a younger woman. I was already a little older, so was he. He had never been married, had no children. I had engaged in a social relationship prior to where I had children and was quote unquote married to this person. And so it was a little bit of a different dynamic, but I can tell you from the very beginning that our conversations from day one were about Mass, and they were about the church. And on the very first public encounter that we had, where we kind of met up and had a little bite to eat after Mass, the very first questions out of our mouths were, what is your expectation of a Catholic wife? Had one. And mine was conversely, what was your expectation of a Catholic, husband or whatever? And we would go back and forth and discuss these things. And so from the very beginning, both of us were equally looking at each other from the lens of our faith.
Right.
Not from our passions or senses, or this person's really good looking, or they're going to make a lot of money, or they come from that. We were looking at is, how serious are each other about the faith? How serious are we about our prayer life? How much virtue do each of us possess, not only in the prudence and temperance area, but in the other virtues too? So there's a lot of conversation with that. And that's what I would encourage all women to really focus on, is that is the most important thing.
And would you then give the same advice to men looking for a Catholic wife?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would be more tough on men Because men, just like Father Ripperger said, and just like the natural law sort of dictates, is men typically don't possess as much, or it's not as natural for them to have developed in the area of self-constraint, particularly physically. They tend to struggle more so in the area of chastity and things of that nature. And so one of the things that I would really admonish them about, or sort of like chastise them like a mom, is that they really need to be looking less at what they can physically see with their own eyes. I mean, there needs to be a level of attraction, I believe in that, but a lot of men put a great emphasis on that, and that's not what is most important. And so I see a lot of men, good Catholic men, who are absolutely compromising their faith, and you can clearly see this woman that they're engaged with has absolutely no modesty, modesty in speech, no modesty in dress. They are not traditional. That is all red flags. Those are all indicators. And I just wrote an article about modesty in dress, and particularly because modesty is not just about dress, but that was what I focused on. And I wrote about that. It's a violation of not only the 6th and the 9th commandment, but it's an indicator of a lack of temperance and prudence. And that should indicate right out the gate, if you physically see a woman who's immodestly dressed, you automatically know this woman has not advanced very much in her spiritual life. So you need to pause right there and ask yourself, there's the question of the equally yoked. Is she serious about her faith? Does she understand the teachings of the faith, etc.? So I would actually be more tough on men and really, really critically and urgently implore them to look at those things that are so easily missed when they're excited, because dating is exciting for a lot of young people. They're like, oh yeah, I'm in love and this is so great. It's going to be wonderful. And they're not thinking clearly about these very important things. Does she possess enough virtue to be the mother of my children that I have not yet had? Is she going to help me get to heaven? These are all really important questions that men need to be asking, but women as well, for themselves.
And what you've just spoken about is largely missing from our catechesis, from even our parents.
Absolutely.
It's really, talking about that stuff it's not happening, I think, because I don't see it happening. It's particularly to our youth, our teens, and they are the ones that need to hear that. So on to the next one, which is kind of related. We've seen a massive loss of morals and virtue among the youth in our society over the last couple of decades. How can we as Catholic women remedy this? What should we be doing to help our sons and daughters navigate through this culture of death that surrounds them and the pressure that they're under to conform to the ways of the world, particularly in the digital age that we're in?
So the first component of this ties back into the era of feminism, right, which goes back to communism and Freemasonry and the like. It's an intentional destruction of our societal norms and all that is good and holy, the Catholic Church, the heart of the Catholic Church. Where do a lot of quote unquote good Catholics, traditional Catholics, as the social media realm calls it, they always complain about the lack of good priests. Well, where do good priests come from? This comes from the home. And what happens in the home? Whose primary role and responsibility is it for the formation and education of children? A lot of modernist Catholics will say both, husband and wife. And while the husband is very, very pivotal and fundamentally critical in the rearing of children, the vast majority of the child's life is going to be spent with the mother. So this goes back to her virtue, her level of self-constraint, her level of understanding of the faith. And so there's a critical need not only for better catechesis in the church, better pre-cana, marital preparation, that is, which I think on the Novus Ordo side is terrible. It's absolutely horrible.
It's horrific,
It does not adequately prepare couples at all for marriage. In fact, I think most pre-cana programs today and many dioceses focus on natural family planning, teaching that up and down, how to deliberately and intentionally abstain under any circumstance, to avoid conception, and then simultaneously financial planning. So there's like not a whole lot about anything else, right? So NFP and financial planning, that's all we learn about. And so, there needs to be something done about that. But, in fighting the culture of death in particular, this starts with husband and wife being properly formed, properly catechized, to understand and take the sacrament of marriage seriously, and are actively and wholly continuously trying to pursue holiness together. Maybe they don't have it all right today, okay? But they're actively trying to study the dogmas of the church. They're trying to understand the writings of our church doctors and our past church fathers. They're trying to grow in holiness. And as they're going through, they're having these children, they're spending a lot of time forming this child, preferably if it's possible homeschooling. I homeschool. I think you had mentioned you homeschool as well. I'm not sure. But, there's a lot of Catholics today. The wife is not staying at home. She's working. And a lot of them will say, there are obviously some Catholic women who unfortunately have to work. Their situation is very dire and very serious, and they just can't get around that. And I'm not talking about them, but I'm talking about some other couples where the wife intentionally and with purpose goes out of the home and works, and she sends her child to school. And then, we send our kids to these public schools or even private schools, quote unquote, Catholic schools that are all been indoctrinated with, propaganda, essentially public school sort of curriculum. And we send them off into the world to be catechized and educated by people who are barely Catholic, and most of them are not Catholic. And then we wonder why they're improperly formed and why they have no virtue and no chastity. So that all goes in the home. And I think catechesis really needs to start young. My youngest child right now is 5. I started his catechesis when I started making my conversion into Catholicism. He was like 2. And I started talking to him about not only the 10 Commandments, but giving him those subtle, foundational teachings and moving from there. And it was the same thing with my older son. There is a culture of death, and that culture of death, especially with the temptations of our youth in the area of purity, in the area of chastity, is going to try to draw the child in every single direction outside of their faith, right? So everything is an inversion of what God actually intended for this child. And so as we're rearing these kids, we need to not only play these active and fundamental roles every single day in their life, but we need to be constantly forming this child's mind from a very early age. You're not waiting until they're 12 or 15 to talk about the teachings of the Catholic Church. This starts very young, and it's very, very structured, and it needs to be very consistent so that this child has no doubt what their faith is and what the church teaches. I think there was part of you asked me like 4 or 5 questions at once, so I hope that covered all of it. I hope so.
I think it did.
But I was trying to remember as I was talking.
I want to follow up there. So, we can't keep our kids in a bubble, although we wish we could. My oldest is 13, and I wish I could just wrap him up in bubble wrap and stick him in the corner. I had a message from a faithful Catholic woman not so long ago. And she homeschooled her daughter. Her daughter's 16 and she's pregnant. And this poor woman is destroyed. I can't even begin to explain her grief to you. How do we, even though her daughter has been formed correctly, she's now obviously been influenced by the culture, influenced by her friends who are not all Catholic. So how do we as mothers navigate that? How do we get around that? We can't sit in on every conversation. We can't, particularly with the cell phones now. What do? We can't wrap them up.
So
what you suggest that we only keep Catholic friends? Do we sort of shelter them that way?
I've seen both ends of the spectrum. So I'm going to answer from the perspective of my former profession. So I spent my entire adult life as a law enforcement officer, and almost all of my law enforcement career, I was in criminal investigations. And the last, 5-6 years was nothing but violent crimes against children, working at a sheriff's office, and a little bit prior to that as well. So, most of my career has been working for women and children, and all of that was child pornography, child exploitation, child abuse in the form of physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. And one of the things I can absolutely ascertain to you and anybody watching is that in every single circumstance of exploitation of a child, meaning maybe they were, lured into a sexual, trafficking ring, or, they were filmed or whatever, and it goes into child pornography. And in almost every case of child sexual abuse, I found something very interesting to myself, even in cases where perhaps the offender was somebody that was a teenager, like, the guy sexually assaulting the girl, maybe he was 17 or 18 and the girl was like 10 or 12. In every single situation, I realized two things. Number one, the parent was not actively engaging that child in a relationship and talking to them about these things like sex and the concept of the conjugal act. And number two, they were not monitoring any of the child's whereabouts, their social media habits, their phones, etc. There's two key things. It's consistent across the board every single time. One of the things I used to work on the last couple of years was called ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children. It was a task force put together nationwide in the United States to combat child pornography and child exploitation online. And so we would get these tips in from, the cyber crimes units and things. And we would look at it. And a lot of the cases that would come in were young girls recording themselves or filming themselves or taking pictures in exploitative fashions. And they were sending them to so-called friends that they thought was friends, or they were sending it to their little high school boyfriend or something. And what they actually ended up being in a lot of cases was that this was not a person she thought was her own age. It was actually like a stranger man, 47 years old in UK, and he was actually luring her in to make these things, and he was selling them on the dark internet, right? The dark web. And so in other cases we had where girls would do this in school, where they would send these videos and pictures of themselves to boys or a boy at their high school. And then the situation always goes south in the puppy love, triangle. And then the boy, to be facetious, or another girl gets a hold of it and she just sends it out to everybody to embarrass the girl. And so I saw this in both situations. But one thing that I noticed there again was the parents were not monitoring anything. So my first response, I have an 11-year-old. That's my oldest one. He's 11. And he has pressured me about this constantly from the time he was like 8 until now, because before I was a stay-at-home, he went to Catholic school. And he's like, all my friends have a phone. Why don't I have a phone? And I'm like, why do you need a phone? Especially now because I'm a stay-at-home thing, my son is not allowed or permitted to have any online at all time without my direct supervision, and it's only for educational purposes. There really is no reason for an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old to have a phone. There is no reason for example, for us Catholics, when we're thinking about our teenagers, and I've had to really sort of premeditate these things because he's getting to be that age, why would I let my 14-year-old son go on a date with a girl?
Right.
What's the purpose of that? Dating is for marriage. It is to discern the vocation of marriage when a person is ready to get married. So there is no purpose for a 14-year-old boy to be going out with another girl in that way. Now, I could see like a friend, like a circle of friends, with, parental chaperoning or supervision, a bunch of friends get together and have fun. And that could be mixed gender at the church or something of that nature. But there's a lot of things in society that are disordered, right? You have a lot of, even today in Catholic homes, where parents will allow their children to have friendships. They allow them to go places without that supervision. They're not actively monitoring these things. And that is one of the key ways that these situations sort of kind of happen. And then the second part of that is that as Catholics, we can't put our children in bubbles. My son plays football, for example, and nobody on his team is Catholic. These are children who, some of them maybe aren't well behaved, and some of them are. Sometimes they use maybe some language we call potty language that we wouldn't necessarily use at home, and things of that nature. And one of the things that I'm deliberately and intentionally using these situations now that my 11-year-old is a bit more mature and he can handle these things, is I'm using the situation to then discuss, because I'm always there, I'm always supervising, but then I'll observe these things, and then on the way home, we'll discuss them. I'll say something like, hey, I noticed that so-and-so was saying these things or making these gestures, and let's talk about that. Let's compare that in light of our faith, and let's think about that. For example, now we don't judge these people for doing any of those things, but we understand why those things are wrong and why that was good. So there are always opportunities. I use almost everything as an opportunity to talk to my son constantly, not only about what he's observing and interacting with in the world, because one of the key things I teach at my homeschool is that, you're going to go out into the world one day and you're going to meet more people who are not Catholic than you are going to meet people who are Catholic, right? So you need to understand that our perspective of the world in this homeschool environment is not reality of the entire world. It's not reflective of all of it. So you need to understand why you believe what you believe, why you are Catholic, why that's important to you. You need to be formed in the right way that you are ready to defend your faith, because I'm constantly showing my sons little snippets of what the world is like right now. And I'm constantly grooming them and preparing them like, hey, this world is crazy, and it's getting crazier by the moment. And you need to be studying these things and reading, because your faith is going to come under fire. You're going to be tested. You're going to be pressured to do these things that are sinful. You're going to be tested to experiment with drugs, to experiment with sexual intercourse, premarital intercourse and fondling and all these terrible things. And so I'm constantly talking about these things. I don't have a daughter, obviously, and I don't necessarily have all of the answers for, Catholic viewers who have daughters, and that brings its own burden and its challenge. But imagining that I did have a daughter, one of the things I would do is do the same thing I'm doing with my son, which is constantly talking and not being afraid to speak about our bodies, right? The sacredness of our bodies, why we're modest, why we're waiting for marriage, why this is important. So those talks really start early. And this goes back into the professional response, is that a lot of the children that I dealt with on the law enforcement side who were sexually abused, and I would, interview them and get to know them and things, almost every single time I would always ask them, once there was a lot of rapport and we were very comfortable, I would say, why didn't you tell mom, or why didn't you tell dad? And, these were always children who had never had those talks with their parents. Their parents had never discussed with them what sexual intercourse was, or what private areas were and why. And so they felt ashamed and they felt gross and icky, right? Because they understood enough to know that this wasn't right, but they also didn't know what their parents were going to say about it, because the parents had never opened that door and had those conversations with them. So, when I was working in particular, I would always talk with my children from a very young age, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, appropriate touch, inappropriate touch, your body is your body, and things like that. And now that they're older, we're going into the theological aspects of that. That's really important, I think, for parents today. And I see that mistake being made with a lot of really good Catholic families, is that I think that they have this understanding that if they just keep their kids at home for the rest of their lives, all until they're 18 years old, that somehow it's going to be okay. But the moment those children go out into the real world, even if they go to a very conservative Catholic college or university, or even study at home, they're eventually going to, especially males, especially boys, are going to enter into the world, and they're going to be 18 to 25 when they do so. And what comes with that? That's all the temptation of the world. And they're going to start to see things that you've never talked about, that you've never exposed them to, that you never told them about. And then they're going to think that you lied to them, that you somehow deceived them, that you were the weirdo, because the world is going to tell them your parents are weirdos and your whole life was weird. And this is what really goes on. And this is what's normal. And so you have to prepare them for this in advance. You have to say, no, this is what's going on in the world, and this is why it's wrong. And this is what you are absolutely going to encounter. And this is how you need to be prepared to combat it. And that's the kind of conversations that I have with my boys constantly about the world around them, so to speak.
So definitely more supervision. And I like that you mentioned, excuse me, showing them pieces of what's going on in the world. I think that's so important, because if we keep everything from them, like you say,
absolutely,
one day they're going to wake up 18 to 25 and it's all just going to be thrown in their face. Absolutely. So I think it's very, very important to show, not show them everything, but make them aware of what is going on. And I myself make sure to do that, especially with my eldest. I'm constantly telling him, this is what the world is saying, but this is what God says. Jess, to end off, because we're running out of time, could you tell us a little bit about your Facebook group, which is for traditional Catholic moms and wives? Why you started it and what you're hoping to achieve with it?
So I started that group last year, actually, with another very wonderful lady, Letitia. Her and I had kind of encountered each other in another so-called traditional Catholic women's group. And I was starting to feel a bit frustrated. So this was right before COVID happened last year. And I had been kicked out of a traditional moms group.
Wow.
Like, they just kicked me out. And it was over the topic of NFP. It never fails. I've been kicked out of like 7 traditional Catholic women's groups for the topic of NFP every single time. And I swear, I try so hard to be like loving and charitable, and they'll always say, oh, you're not loving and charitable. So now I got to the point where I'll put in love and charity, comma, I say this with gentleness, and I'm trying to really convey that, but it never fails. They'll kick me out. And so I started saying to this woman, Letitia, when we started talking, we first met, I was like, there's all these groups that say that they're traditional. They're like, oh, traditional Catholic moms and wives, or traditional Catholic this or whatever. And then you get in there and you realize they're not traditional at all. This is infiltrated with like Novus Ordo, modernist, or people sometimes aren't even Catholic, you know? And I'm like, gosh, this is really terrible. And so, you know, where is this place where, you know, I started talking with Letitia about this in private discourse in the messenger. I'm like, you know, I've been kicked out of all these groups. I at that time, really, I was, you know, wanting to find a place to relate to other women, because where I was living, there really wasn't a lot of traditional Catholic women. Right. And so I was just kind of getting to this frustrated place. I wanted to network with people and really connect with other women and hear from them and meet somebody who was far more advanced than myself to help me. And so she was like, let's start our own group. And I'm like, that's a great idea. And so we then begot this brainstorming between the two of us, and we started thinking about how we would make this whole thing come to pass. And then it just, you know, eventually we got it off the ground. And so what the group was formed to be was to provide a genuinely and authentically Catholic environment, period, full stop. So, you know, we are the place where you're going to come as a woman, whether you're single or married or consecrated, or you're a wife or not wife, you're a mother, perhaps you haven't had children yet, or whatever the situation may be. And, you know, it's a place for you to come where not only you can learn about the traditional aspects of the faith, the Catholicism, like real Catholicism, right? But you can also ask the questions that you're not really to ask in other groups, especially about NFP, contraceptives, you know, the history of the mantilla, modesty, all these topics that really spiral out of control in other groups because they're so heavily infiltrated. This is a group that you can come and ask those questions. You're going to get genuine answers. And if we can't provide them to you, we're going to research them thoroughly, according and weigh them against what the saints have said, what the church doctors have said, what the church fathers have said. And we're going to provide you citations and references for you to do your own research and actually see what the real teachings of the church is. So that's what it's come to be. And, you know, it's been a bit of a slow start, so to speak. It didn't take off that well initially, and then it just started kind of growing slowly and incrementally. You know, and we do heavily vet the group. So, you know, we have a lot of questions, or a few questions to answer when you come in. And then once you come in, you know, we heavily moderate and monitor that, in the sense of we're looking at everything people are commenting on and responding. And if there's anything that's posted or said that's modernistic or contrary to the teachings of the faith, we will not only remove it, but we'll kind of have that conversation and sort of give the person a room to correct themselves. But if they don't, then we'll have them removed, because we're not going to become one of those groups like on other groups on Facebook where it's just infiltrated out the wazoo and there's no spiritual benefit of it whatsoever. It's just chit chatter and it's just opinions. We don't want opinions. We want truth. We want doctrine is what we want.
And to grow with each other.
Absolutely.
So we'll leave the link for that as well in the description. Jess, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Enjoyed talking to you. And I hope we'll have you on again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'll be praying for you over there, and you stay safe, and definitely God bless you and your family.
God bless you, Jess. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right ahead.